she said, "I'll work your fields, master, just feed my hungry children." The dust of the market town clung to the air, a bitter powder stirred by the indifferent shuffle of feet and the last, weary sighs of the late afternoon sun. Elias stood apart, a pillar of granite amidst the shifting human tide, his business done, his customary impatience to return to the solitude of his farm etching deeper lines around his mouth. It was then that the tableau of cruelty unfolded, stark and ugly against the backdrop of commerce. A woman, thin as a starved wolf, her clothes the color of road dirt, knelt before a bellowing merchant, his face a purple knot of fury. Two small children, ghosts with wide, terrified eyes, clung to her ragged skirts. The merchant's hand was raised, a slab of meat ready to strike, his accusations of theft, a stale loaf of bread clutched in the older child's trembling fist, slicing through the market's din. The crowd, a hydra of self-righteousness, muttered its assent, their faces hard, unyielding. Elara, for that was her name, though none there knew it or cared, shielded her children with her body, her own face a mask of fierce, desperate protection, yet her shoulders bowed under an invisible weight of shame and unending hardship. Elias, who had made a fortress of his heart against the world's clamor, felt an unwelcome tremor within its stone walls. He was a man of the earth, of silence, of beasts and seasons, not of men and their petty cruelties. Yet, the sight of the children, their small bodies racked with hunger, their eyes reflecting a desolation no child should ever know, was a chisel against his resolve. He moved, not with hesitation, but with the deliberate force of a slow river changing course. His shadow fell over the scene, quieting the merchant's tirade. He did not speak, merely met the man's enraged gaze with an unnerving stillness, then laid down coins on the dusty stall, far more than the bread was worth. The merchant, deflating, snatched them up. The crowd, sensing a shift, murmured anew, their curiosity now tinged with a grudging respect for the silent, imposing stranger. Elara looked up at him, her gaze traveling from his worn boots to his impassive face, searching for motive, for meaning. In her world, kindness was a forgotten language. When he turned to leave, a silent command for her to follow, she hesitated only a moment. Then, scrambling to her feet, pulling her children close, she hurried after his retreating form. As they reached the edge of the town, where the cultivated lands gave way to the wilder, unkempt territories leading to his isolated homestead, she finally spoke, her voice raspy from disuse and fear, the words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. "I'll work your fields, master, just feed my hungry children." The word master hung heavy in the air, a relic of a past she was fleeing, a measure of her despair. Elias stopped, turned. He looked at her, then at the boy, Tam, clutching the bread, and the girl, Lyra, whose thumb was wedged firmly in her mouth, her eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. He gave a curt nod, a gesture so minimal it might have been missed, but to Elara, it was a lifeline. He led them into the fading light, towards his lonely farm, a place where the silence was broken only by the wind and the call of distant birds, a sanctuary or a new kind of prison she did not yet know. He offered them the small, detached stone cot that had once housed seasonal workers, its interior Spartan but clean. He left a pail of fresh water, a sack of potatoes, and a side of cured meat on the rough-hewn table, then retreated to his own house, the unspoken agreement settling between them like the evening mist. There were no further words, no conditions laid down, only the shared space of his land, and the silent promise of sustenance in exchange for labor. That night, for the first time in many nights, Elara and her children slept on full stomachs, huddled together under a threadbare blanket Elias had left by the door, the scent of earth and old stone a strange lullaby. The dawn found Elara already stirring, the ingrained habits of survival urging her to prove her worth. The rhythm of the farm became their silent language. Elias would rise before the sun, his movements economical and precise as he tended to his livestock, his tools, his land. He found Elara was often already awake, a shadow moving with quiet purpose in the pre-dawn gloom. She did not wait for instruction but observed, learned, and then acted. The small cot, once bare, began to show signs of her tending, wildflowers in a chipped jug, a meticulously swept threshold. She mended fences with nimble fingers, her stitches small and even. She cleared a patch of overrun ground near the cot and, with seed she must have hoarded from some forgotten place or perhaps gleaned from the wild, began to coax life from the stubborn soil, a tiny vegetable garden, a promise of future nourishment. Her children, Tam and Lyra, shadows of their mother, were quiet and watchful. Once the initial hollow hunger had been filled, a spark returned to their eyes. Tam, serious and observant, would try to mimic Elias's chores, gathering fallen branches into neat piles or carrying small buckets of water, his small face set in concentration. Lyra, more reserved, would often sit near her mother as she worked, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust, her gaze flitting between the vast, indifferent sky and the broad, stoic figure of the man who had taken them in. Elias watched them all. From the corner of his eye as he mended a plough, from the window of his house as he ate his solitary meal. He saw Elara's resilience, the way she moved with an economy born of hardship, her hands, though calloused and scarred, gentle with the animals, coaxing a nervous hen to lay, soothing a restless calf. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the quick understanding of a task demonstrated once. His initial pity, a distant, uncomfortable emotion, began to transform, slowly, imperceptibly, into a grudging respect, then a burgeoning curiosity about the woman who spoke so little yet communicated so much through her tireless industry and quiet dignity. He began to leave extra portions of food, a slightly larger piece of cheese, a few apples from his meager orchard, on the cot's doorstep. He found an old, sturdy pair of boots that might fit her and left them there, too, without a word. She accepted these offerings with a slight inclination of her head if their paths crossed, or he would simply find the items gone, put to good use. The vast silence of his farm, once a solace for his own scarred soul, now held a new, subtle vibration, the presence of others, the quiet hum of their lives intertwining with his. He found himself listening for the distant sound of Lyra's occasional, soft laughter, or the murmur of Elara's voice as she spoke to her children in words too low for him to catch. The loneliness he had cultivated for so long had not vanished, but it had shifted, its edges softened by an awareness of these three souls sharing his isolated world. He remembered the feel of young Tam's small hand briefly brushing his as they both reached for a fallen tool, a fleeting contact that sent an unfamiliar warmth through him. He found himself mending a child's broken wooden toy, a small, carved bird, left forgotten near the woodpile, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle with the delicate object. He left it on the cot's window-sill, feeling a strange mixture of awkwardness and a quiet, unacknowledged satisfaction when he later saw Lyra clutching it tightly. The unspoken agreement held, a fragile truce between his solitude and their desperate need, slowly, painstakingly, evolving into something more, something neither of them could yet name, under the silent, watchful eyes of the mountains that ringed his land. The first crack in the wall of silence and stoicism came not with a dramatic upheaval, but with the mundane cruelty of an accident. A late autumn storm had swept through, leaving a trail of sodden earth and broken branches. Elara, determined to secure a loose shutter on the small barn that housed Elias's meager flock of sheep, had climbed a rickety ladder. Elias, mending tack nearby, heard not a cry, but the sharp crack of wood and a soft thud. He was there in moments, his heart lurching with an unfamiliar dread. She lay on the damp ground, her face pale, her hand clutched to her side, a dark stain blossoming on the rough fabric of her sleeve. The ladder lay splintered beside her. He knelt, his usual gruffness momentarily lost. "Elara," he said, her name feeling strange and potent on his tongue in this moment of crisis. Her eyes, wide with pain, met his. He gently eased her hand away from her arm, revealing a deep, ragged gash, bleeding freely. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms. She was shockingly light, and carried her towards his own house, the children, who had appeared as if from the earth itself, trailing behind, their small faces etched with terror. He laid her on his own narrow bed, the first time she had crossed its threshold. His movements were surprisingly deft as he fetched clean water, old linen for bandages, and a salve of herbs he kept for animal wounds, grimacing internally at the inadequacy of his supplies for a human injury. As he cleaned the wound, his touch unexpectedly gentle, Elara watched him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Lyra began to weep softly, a heart-breaking sound in the quiet room. Tam stood stiffly by the door, his small fists clenched, trying to be brave. Elias, his task complete, the bandage starkly white against her skin, looked at her. The silence in the room was thick, charged with unspoken fear and a raw intimacy. It was Elara who finally broke it, her voice a low murmur, strained with pain and something else, something deeper. They said I was cursed, she whispered, her eyes fixed on some distant, painful memory. My husband, he believed them. After the fever took our first boy, a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Elias paused, his hand still. He had wondered about her past, the shadows that haunted her eyes. He had no words of comfort, no easy platitudes. He only knew the weight of loss, the sting of being an outsider. He finished securing the bandage, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Curses are for fools, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You work hard. The arm will mend. The children are safe here. It was a simple declaration, devoid of sentimentality, yet it held a profound validation. He was not dismissing her pain, but rather her accusers. He saw her worth, not a curse. He saw strength. Later that evening, after he had settled the children in the cot with a warm meal and an extra blanket, he returned to his house. Elara was asleep, her breathing shallow but even. He sat in his worn wooden chair, watching her in the dim light of a single candle. The vulnerability of her sleeping form, the trust implicit in her presence in his private space, chipped away another layer of his carefully constructed defenses. He thought of the word, cursed, and a slow anger burned within him. He had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty to believe in such convenient labels for misfortune. He saw only a woman who had endured, who protected her young with a fierceness that mirrored the wild creatures of his lands, and who asked for nothing but a chance. The shared hardship, the forced proximity, the brief, raw revelation of her past, it was a fissure, letting in a sliver of light, a fragile connection forged in pain and his unexpected, gruff tenderness. The unspoken agreement was subtly changing. It was no longer just about survival and work, but about a shared humanity, a dawning, unspoken care. The fragile piece of their isolated existence was not destined to last. The world outside Elias's fence line, with its insatiable hunger for gossip and its fear of the unknown, began to encroach. It started subtly, like the first chill wind of winter. On a rare trip to the market town for essential supplies, salt, ironmongery, news of the wider world he usually shunned, Elias had allowed Elara and the children to accompany him. He needed her eye for bartering for thread and cloth, her quiet knowledge of what the children truly needed. It was a mistake, he realized too late. The townsfolk, their memories long and their suspicions easily aroused, saw them. Eyes narrowed. Whispers followed them like persistent flies. That's him, the hermit from the high valley, and that's the vagrant woman, isn't it? The one who was begging last spring with her brats. What's he doing with her? The words, sharp as flint, pricked at Elias's stoic composure. He saw Elara flinch, her shoulders drawing inwards, her hand tightening on Lyra's. He wanted to snarl, to drive them back with the sheer force of his will, but he held his silence, his face a stony mask, hurrying them through their purchases and back towards the relative safety of his lands. But the seeds of malice had been sown. Soon, a local preacher, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips, made veiled pronouncements from his pulpit about unholy alliances and moral contagion corrupting the decent folk of the valley. Though Elias was not there to hear it, the word spread, carried on the breath of righteous indignation, reaching even his remote farmstead through the occasional, wary traveler or a shepherd passing with his flock. Then came the more direct incursions. One blustery afternoon, a group of 3 men from the town, emboldened by drink and the preacher's words, rode up to his gate. They were led by the merchant Elias had confronted months before, his face still bearing the imprint of the remembered humiliation, now overlaid with a smug sense of communal backing. Elias, the merchant shouted, his voice carrying an unearned authority. We've come to talk sense into you. About that woman. She's no good. A blight. You need to send her and her young uns packing. For the good of the community. Elias emerged from his barn, a heavy wooden mallet in his hand, its presence more a statement of his mood than an immediate threat. He stood before them, solid and unmoving as the ancient stones of his farmhouse. Elara had appeared in the doorway of the cot, the children half hidden behind her skirts, her face pale but resolute. "This is my land," Elias stated, his voice low and dangerous. "My business, it becomes our business when you harbor her kind." Another man, burly and red-faced, sneered, spitting onto the ground. "Whispers say she's a witch, brought bad luck to her last village." "We don't want that here." Elias's gaze, cold as a winter river, swept over them. He saw their fear, their ignorance, their pathetic need to find a scapegoat for their own small, unhappy lives. He thought of Ilara's tireless work, the way her small garden was now flourishing, the gentle way she spoke to his animals, the fierce love in her eyes when she looked at her children. He thought of the laughter he sometimes heard from the cot, a sound that had been absent from his life for too long. His resolve, already tested, hardened into unshakable conviction. This was no longer just about offering shelter, it was about defending something precious, something he was only beginning to understand he valued beyond his own solitude. The external threat was no longer a whisper, it was a physical presence at his gate, demanding he break the fragile bond he had forged with the woman and her children. The time for silent observation was over. Elias planted his feet wider, the mallet held loosely but ready at his side. The wind whipped his hair across his brow, but his eyes, fixed on the intruders, did not waver. The men shifted uneasily under his unwavering gaze, their bluster faltering slightly in the face of his silent, implacable resistance. The merchant, however, pushed forward. "Don't be a fool, Elias. We're many. You're one. Just send her out." "No trouble." Elias's lips curled into a semblance of a snarl. The time for few words was past, now was the time for the truth, blunt and unvarnished. "This woman," he began, his voice deeper now, resonating with a power that surprised even himself, carrying over the wind's moan, "you call her a blight. You whisper of curses and bad luck. You know nothing." He took a step forward, and the men instinctively took one back. "Her name is Ilara." The use of her name, spoken with such firmness, was a shield, a declaration. From the corner of his eye, he saw Ilara straighten, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Since she came to this barren place you all shun," Elias continued, his gaze sweeping over each man, pinning them with contempt, "these fields have seen more care than in all my years alone. The fences are mended, not with grudging labor, but with a will to build. My animals are calmer, healthier, because her hands are kind, not cruel." He gestured towards the cot, where a small patch of vibrant green defied the coming winter. "She coaxed life from soil I had given up on, to feed her children, to bring a touch of beauty to a place that had forgotten it. She has worked harder, with more spirit and more intelligence, than any man in your gossiping town. She has faced down starvation, cruelty, and your ignorant hatred, and she still stands with dignity." His voice rose, imbued with a righteous anger that had long lay dormant. "You speak of her as if she is less than human. She is more human than any of you. She is a mother, fierce and loving. She is a survivor, strong and unbroken. She has brought not a curse, but a quiet resilience to this land, and a spark of warmth to a house that was cold for too long." He took another step. The men were now visibly cowed. "If you believe your foolish tales of curses, then perhaps you should fear the one you might bring upon yourselves by harming the innocent. She is under my protection. Her children are under my protection. This is their home." He paused, his final words dropping like stones into a deep well. "If you have a problem with Ilara, you have a problem with me. Now, leave my land. And do not return." For a long moment, silence reigned, broken only by the whistling wind. The merchant's face was mottled, his bravado utterly gone. He looked at his companions, who avoided his gaze, their eyes darting nervously towards the unyielding figure of Elias. Finally, with a muttered curse, the merchant turned his horse, and the others followed, retreating in disarray, their threats dissolving into the empty air. Elias watched them go, his chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly ebbing. He did not lower the mallet until they were distant specks on the horizon. Only then did he turn. Ilara stood in the doorway, her children peeking around her. Her face was etched with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher, or gratitude, perhaps something more. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, something profound shifted. The unspoken agreement, the roles of protector and protected began to meld, to transform into something akin to a partnership, forged in the crucible of public defiance. He had not just defended her, he had declared her value, her worth, to the world, and in doing so, to himself. He gave a curt nod, the closest he could come to acknowledging the magnitude of the moment, then turned back towards the barn, the familiar rhythm of work a welcome anchor. But the silence that followed was different now, no longer just an absence of words, but a space filled with a new, powerful understanding. The confrontation at the gate was a prelude, a rumble of thunder before the true storm. Weeks later, as winter began to tighten its icy grip on the high valley, a tempest of unimaginable ferocity descended. It was not the predictable, slow-moving blizzards Elias knew, but a sudden, violent onslaught of wind and snow, a malevolent white fury that seemed to claw at the very bones of his farm. The sky turned a bruised, churning grey, then vanished altogether behind a solid wall of driving snow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof tiles, rattling the shutters, and threatening to rip the ancient barn from its foundations. Elias fought his way to the livestock, the air thick with blinding white, each step a monumental effort. The sheep huddled, terrified, their bleating lost in the roar. He secured the doors, reinforced a weakening beam, but knew, with a sinking feeling, that his efforts might be futile against such elemental rage. It was then, as he battled his way back towards the main house, that he saw Elara. She wasn't cowering in the cot. Instead, she was out in the maelstrom, her thin frame braced against the wind, her hair a wild banner, her eyes narrowed with an intense, almost preternatural focus. She was shouting something, but her words were snatched away by the gale. He fought his way towards her. "Get inside," he yelled, his voice barely audible. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pointed towards the oldest section of the barn, the part that housed his 2 aging cows and a newborn calf. "There," she screamed, her voice piercing the wind's howl. "It will go there. The wall is weak." Elias squinted through the swirling snow. He had checked that wall, it had seemed sound enough. But there was an urgency in her eyes, a certainty that brooked no argument. It was more than a guess, it felt like a prophecy. Trusting an instinct he didn't understand, he nodded. Together, they battled their way to the vulnerable section. The wind here was a physical blow, threatening to sweep them off their feet. Inside, the cows lowed in terror, the calf trembling beside its mother. Elara, moving with a desperate swiftness, began pointing to specific timbers, specific joints. "Here," she urged, her hand showing him where to brace, where to reinforce with spare lumber and rope he kept for emergencies. It was as if she could see the storm's intent, feel the precise points of catastrophic failure before they occurred. He worked, his muscles straining, the cold biting deep, but a strange energy flowed between them, a synchronized dance against destruction. She anticipated his needs, handing him tools, holding beam steady, her smaller frame surprisingly effective. Where his brute strength met its match, her intuitive understanding of leverage and stress points guided their efforts. Hours passed in a blur of frantic activity, the storm relentlessly pounding them. At one point, a huge gust tore a section of the roof from the newer part of the barn, sending debris flying. But the old wall, the one Elara had insisted they fortify, held. It groaned, it shuddered, but it held. As the first, faint glimmers of a struggling dawn began to penetrate the diminishing fury, they found themselves slumped against that very wall, exhausted, soaked, and freezing, but alive. The animals, though terrified, were safe. The worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick, silent blanket of white. Elara's breathing was ragged. She looked at him, her face smudged with dirt and snow, her eyes luminous in the pale light. She had revealed a profound, almost uncanny intuition, a skill that went beyond mere farm knowledge. It was a deep, primal connection to the forces of nature, or perhaps a heightened perception born from a life of constant vigilance. This intuition had been critical. Without her guidance, the old barn would have collapsed, his precious livestock lost. They both knew it. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage and the eerie calm after the storm, they were no longer just a man and a woman who shared a space, nor even protector and protected. They were two souls who had faced death together and survived, bound by a shared ordeal and the revelation of her extraordinary, silent strength. He reached out, his gloved hand covering hers where it rested on a beam, a silent acknowledgement of what she had done, of what they had done, together. The aftermath of the storm was a landscape of stark, silent beauty and brutal devastation. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of digging out, mending, and salvaging what they could. The main house had weathered the onslaught, as had the little cot, miraculously sheltered by a drift, but the newer section of the barn was a ruin, and sections of fencing had vanished under mountainous drifts. Elias and Ilara worked side by side, their movement synchronized by shared purpose and exhaustion. The children, bundled and cherubic in the snow, helped in small ways, their earlier fear replaced by the resilience of youth. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, they sat in Elias's small kitchen, the only room warm enough to inhabit comfortably. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Tam and Lyra were asleep, huddled together on a makeshift bed of blankets near the warmth. A profound quiet filled the room, not the silence of distance, but of shared experience, of battles fought and won. The emotional tension, held taut for so long by unspoken words and guarded hearts, finally began to fray. Elias looked at Ilara. Her hair, damp from melted snow, framed a face etched with weariness but also with a serene strength he had come to admire, to depend on. The memory of her fierce certainty in the heart of the storm, her hand guiding his, was vivid in his mind. He had lived a life of self-reliance, believing he needed no one. The storm, and Ilara, had shown him the fallacy of that belief. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Words, always difficult for him, felt like boulders he had to move. Ilara, he began, his voice raspy. She turned her gaze from the fire to him, her eyes clear and direct, waiting. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, not unlike the one he had mended for Lyra, but older, smoother, its wood darkened with age. It was his mother's, a keepsake he had carried for decades, a tangible link to a time before his heart had closed itself off. He held it out to her. "My mother," he said, the words a monumental offering. She loved birds. She would have liked your spirit. Ilara's eyes widened slightly. She looked from the bird to his face, understanding dawning. He wasn't just offering a trinket. He was offering a piece of himself, a piece of his past. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He pressed the bird into her palm, his calloused fingers briefly, gently, closing over hers. "Stay," he said, the word raw, stripped of all artifice. Not just for the work. Not just for shelter. He met her gaze, his own vulnerable, open for the first time. "This is your home now. With me. With the children. If you'll have it." Ilara's fingers tightened around the small bird. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of sorrow or pain, but of a profound, overwhelming release. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, glittering in the firelight. She nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Then, she spoke his name again, Elias, but this time it was different, imbued with a soft intimacy, an acceptance that resonated deep within his soul. She didn't need grand pronouncements. Her quiet affirmation, the gentle pressure of her hand responding to his, was enough. It was more than enough. The walls around his heart, battered by her resilience, her quiet competence, and now her intuitive strength, finally crumbled, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gentle yielding, making space for a new, shared future. In the warmth of the fire, surrounded by the sleeping children and the silent promise of the carved bird, their unspoken agreement transformed into an unspoken vow, a true, reciprocal emotional bond forged in the heart of the storm and sealed in its quiet aftermath. Years passed, seasons turning like the pages of a well-loved book. The farm, once a testament to Elias's solitary struggle, transformed under their shared care. It was no longer just a place of toil, but a sanctuary of quiet abundance and gentle rhythms. Ilara's garden had expanded, a riot of color and fragrance in the summer, its bounty filling their root cellar in the winter. The orchard Elias had neglected for years now bore plentiful fruit, its branches pruned and tended with her knowing hands. The barn, rebuilt stronger than before, housed healthy livestock, and the laughter of Tam and Lyra, now growing into thoughtful, capable young people, echoed across the fields where Elias and Elara worked side by side, their silence companionable, their words, when spoken, carrying weight and affection. Elias was no longer the grim, isolated stoic. The harsh lines around his mouth had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He still spoke little, but his eyes, when they rested on Elara or the children, held a warmth that spoke volumes. Elara, too, had blossomed. The haunted look in her eyes had faded, replaced by a serene confidence. She moved with grace and purpose, her unique gifts, her intuitive understanding of the land, her gentle way with all living things, now a source of strength, not suspicion. The community in the valley, once so quick to condemn, had slowly, grudgingly, shifted its stance. The tale of their survival in the great storm, Elara's uncanny foresight, had become a local legend. Some still kept their distance, muttering old prejudices, but many came to respect them. They sought Elara's advice on ailing animals or blighted crops, her quiet wisdom often proving more effective than any learned remedy. They saw the thriving farm, the happy children, the quiet devotion between the man and woman who had weathered so much. Elias, once the hermit, was now seen as a man of quiet strength, made stronger by the woman at his side. Elara, once the outcast, the cursed one, was revered by some as a woman of rare insight, her connection to the earth a gift, not a threat. Their love, never one for grand declarations, was an enduring presence, woven into the fabric of their daily lives, a shared glance over the dinner table, a comforting hand on a weary shoulder, the quiet joy of watching their children grow. It was a love built on resilience, mutual respect, and the profound understanding that true belonging is found not in the absence of storms, but in the courage to face them together. Their home, once a refuge from a harsh world, had become a beacon of quiet hope, a testament to the enduring power of kindness and the strength found in unspoken devotion. The carved bird his mother had loved sat on the mantelpiece, a silent witness to a love that had taken root in barren ground and blossomed against all odds. In a world that so often shouts, where worth is measured in noise and acceptance is conditional, where does the quiet heart find its home? Is it in the grand gestures, the public declarations? Or does true strength, true connection, bloom in the silences, in the steadfast presence, in the unspoken understanding between two souls who have seen the worst of the world and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage? Perhaps resilience isn't just about enduring the storm, but about finding the courage to let someone else hold the lantern in the darkness, to trust that their unique light can guide you through. What quiet acts of courage have shaped your own life, and whose silent strength have you, perhaps, overlooked? If this story of Elias and Elara, of a love built on quiet whispers and profound actions, has touched your heart and stirred your thoughts, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Join us for more tales that explore the depths of the human spirit, the resilience of love, and the enduring power of connection in a world that often forgets to listen.